Hello, and welcome to today's Water Tower Research Fireside Chat. I am your host, Dmitry Silversteyn, and I am the senior analyst covering the chemicals and materials technology sector at Water Tower Research. Today, I'm being joined by Brian Leeners, Chief Executive Officer of Homerun Resources, to discuss the company's efforts to develop a high-purity silica resource in Brazil aimed at supplying the rapidly expanding solar market industry in that country. Before we begin, I want to remind listeners that the company's safe harbor statements can be found on the company website, www.homerunresources.com. And this fireside chat may not be reproduced or written transcript distributed without the express written consent of Water Tower Research. With that out of the way, welcome, Brian, and let's get back to discussion at hand. So it does sound like your resource is truly unique in terms of the impurities to begin with, which allows you to produce this high quality glass without a lot of chemical steps, which would also be, I guess, environmentally problematic for your competitors.
Yeah, and there's an economic burden there too, right? Because the cost
Absolutely.
of antimony and China has sealed up its antimony supplies because it has such a large solar industry. That's really the reason they've done it. And so the price of antimony has shot up because of that, because it's a key component of that overall Chinese solar package. So from that perspective, if you can eliminate antimony from the production of solar glass, then you have effectively reduced your cost of goods sold, which is obviously a real benefit for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. So beyond solar glass, you've also been advancing additional high value applications. You referenced a couple previously. You've highlighted the bench scale work with UCD around silicon carbide and fused silica glass. What have those trials demonstrated so far, and how do you how do they expand the end market opportunity beyond solar glass for your company?
When we initiated the relationship with UCD, it was to effectively look at the way that people were processing silica and advancing, purifying silica and advancing new materials that are made from or advanced materials that are made from silica. So, we've had several successes with them. We filed a patent now related to the femto laser purification process for silica sand. The second thing that we did with them was we used a thermoelectric technique, a common one, in order to produce silicon carbide from our silica and a graphite source that is an affiliated company. And then the last announcement is that we have now been able to process our silica to fused silica and doing that through that same readily available purification or processing through the thermoelectric process. So using electricity to purify and process is a benefit in itself. But you need to do those things economically. Like otherwise, it's just science. And science is great, but otherwise, it's just science. So we've been focused on the economic benefit of these processes as well as the science. So for instance, fused silica, the biggest silica companies that produce fused silica, they're going through 5 to 7 steps to get from their original silica sand or quartz to that fused silica product. So when you can take our raw silica and apply that thermoelectric technique to it, and you're creating fused silica that way, I mean, obviously it's a super high temperature, but electricity can achieve that cheaply. You've cut out all those steps. So that in itself presents an economic argument. The second economic argument, which is really, really important, is can you scale it? And what we focused on, in particular with the silicon carbide and the fused silica, is that we want to be able to develop these new techniques, but we want to do so with products that are pulled off the shelf, off the shelf equipment, as we like to call it. We'll see some announcements going forward as to how we're doing that. Fused silica obviously is the huge buzz right now because of the massive interest in fused silica relative to technology, in particular photonics and quantum computing, and new forms of memory storage using high-end glass. So those are large markets. We're talking AI, we're talking quantum computing, we're talking huge data storage markets. Those are advanced country markets. Those are European, US, Asia Pacific markets. But to be able to produce fused silica at a lower price, the biggest barrier to market acceptance across a lot of different use cases is that fused silica is hard to come by, the high quality stuff, and it's very expensive to produce. So if we're successful in this testing, first step's done, we're on step number 2, which is scaling using off-the-shelf equipment. Then we will have, put ourselves in a place where all we have to do now is design what that plant would look like to produce larger quantities of that product. And that product, obviously, Dmitry sells it a lot more than a handful of our silica sitting in Bahia, Brazil.
Good point. Understood, Brian. So just a quick follow-up. When you look at these, do you view these as sort of parallel revenue opportunities or longer-term opportunities once you have your base business established?
They're all operating in parallel. We spent the first 3 years, as we talked about earlier, consolidating the district and then looking at the verticals. And then last year in particular, we had a lot of news. It was so much news, I think it was a little overwhelming for the market. But all of that news was related to taking those verticals and building steep density in each one. So I think what you're seeing now, and again, today's announcement relative to first sales is an example of that. We're completing our verticals, right? Vertically integrated company needs to complete its verticals. A completed vertical is revenue coming in at the far end of the vertical. So they're all going in parallel. We're doing that within the context of the fact that capital is scarce. We've been really good at allocating our capital over the last 3+ years in building out a pretty substantive business model. And again, we've got a lot of depth in that model, and we're in commercialization to sales in every one of those verticals. I know we're doing development and R&D work, for instance, in fused silicon, silicon carbide, but we could easily go to the traditional method of producing those and move that forward. We're just looking at doing that in a better way from an environmental perspective, and doing that in a better economic way by reducing a whole pile of traditional steps.
Great, Brian. Thank you. Now, let's move on a little bit here. How do all of these, we went through a lot, so how do all of these pieces, the resource consolidation, the third-party validation, the downstream R&D that you guys are doing, how do they come together to progress you towards a bankable feasibility study and ultimately building that solar glass manufacturing facility?
Well, the bankable feasibility study is really a culmination of probably about 2 years worth of effort internally. Assuming that we paralleled that with the consolidation of the district, we've acquired a piece of ground next door to the resource to reduce our logistical costs of moving the silica, which is the dominant component of glass, easily to the glass plant. We're really lucky because we have, you could take a shovel full of our silica, basically clean it and throw it in the furnace. So we don't have the processing steps that a traditional glass company would have, or their silica supply partner would have to have in order for that silica to go into the furnace. We've been working on the far end of the vertical, which is we've lined up offtake partners which exceed what we see as our first throughput total, that 1,000 tons per day that we're planning on producing at, or the capacity of that plant. So from that perspective, this is what I mean about building the density. It's not like start at point A and then B and C. We're all the way along that vertical from a solar glass perspective, and building all of those components at the same time. It's hats off to our management team relative to doing that. I'm a pretty demanding CEO when it comes to completing tasks. Um, but we're lucky because some of those elements were gifted to us by nature. We're now talking to solar glass module makers outside of Brazil. Um, again, last week we're talking to the U.S. government who are like, whoa, we're looking to move our supply chains, and obviously solar is an important part of our energy supply. And American companies, they need to find sources of materials that are outside the United States. So, that's a firsthand conversation with senior U.S. government officials whose task it is, by the way, to go to Brazil and come to Brazil and meet with companies like ours to achieve those goals. So from that perspective, you can see, there's a ton of elements. Everybody at the end of the day goes, wow, you just produced solar glass, but all of those pieces are coming together. Within the next couple of years, we'll be producing solar glass, and that solar glass should be the highest quality solar glass in the world. It should be antimony free, which we believe will give us a premium price within the context of how the glass market operates. So we're really excited. That's one vertical, and those are the steps in that one vertical.
I see that's very good. So let me ask you this. Looking at your broader silica to advanced material strategy, and you've outlined it very well in this conversation, which key elements would you consider already executed, and what are the most important pieces still left to be delivered?
The biggest component of validation of a materials company moving to an advanced materials company, in other words, taking your raw material and turning it into an advanced material, the biggest thing is bench testing, right? And we went to Anzaplan in Germany, who in the silica space are the best group outside of China relative to taking your silica and running it through a sequence of tree diagrams relative to, okay, we're going down this path. There's 5 different avenues after that path, and it's a very complicated process. And these are all techniques for processing that basic product, which is really high grade to start with, and then taking it into those various end uses. The exciting component of that was in the final report is we can achieve almost every end use. There's only one that we haven't achieved yet. We'll probably get there with some tweaking here and tweaking there. But the reality is that's the super high end of the market. It's a relatively small market. But we can do all of the other stuff. So what makes me excited is that, we can move our product into silicon carbide, which is, the next generation of silicon. We can move our product as a high-end fused silica product into a variety of different markets, which is a massive market that's growing at a very quick CAGR over the next 10, 20, 30 years relative to the importance of silica and glass and optics in the technology space. There's a big transition going on in the technology space on how we move information from using electrons versus using light. And if you're using light, guess what? It's optics. You're using glass. So from that perspective, we're in a really good position to be a key player in the evolution of those new technologies, and within the context of the energy space relative to the advancements in solar and relative to the advancements in battery technologies. And silicon carbide, we believe, is an excellent solution for anodes that's relatively cheap. And obviously silicon carbide has a variety of use cases within the technology space as well. So, we're at the beginning. We're at the beginning. This is a small company, but we have a huge advantage. And most small companies don't start with that type of advantage. We have a huge advantage, and this is not a window of opportunity because we're sitting on a unique resource. That unique resource is required in all of these different categories, and it's like, where do we get it from? You get it from Homerun Resources.
Understood. So it sounds like you're going to be participating, or you're looking to participate in a lot of fast-growing markets with strong secular tailwinds behind them. If we can drill down a little bit and you kind of look over the next, let's say, 12 to 24 months, what are the most important milestones that that I think you'll need to deliver to demonstrate the continuing progress towards commercialization of this unique by every aspect resource?
Scaling revenue. That's the key one. Securing the resource was the most important step. Now scaling revenue is the most important step because your value fundamentally comes off revenue, cash flow, EBITDA, use the metric you want. So from that perspective, if we just look at the industrial silica space, today we announced our first partnership. That's key. What's more important, from my personal opinion, what's more important in that news release, or most important in that news release, is that we've put together a B2B strategy to do that. So if it's not a primary direct sale market, then we need distributors. So to build up distribution, in a non-core market and start to get revenue out of that non-core market, that's huge for us. But if you look at the industrial market in total, the biggest end use for our silica as far as matching the use case is solar glass. So if we go from where we are today to where we'll be in your time period 2-3 years from now, we'll be selling hundreds of thousands of tons a year of our product. Okay, that's scaling revenue within one vertical, which is industrial silica.
Understood. Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you for sharing the Homerun Resources story and giving our viewers another angle on investing in the energy transition and other megatrends that you mentioned. Again, thank you for joining us. Before we end, please note that the views expressed on this fireside chat may not necessarily reflect the views of Water Tower Research LLC and are provided for informational purposes only. This fireside chat may not be distributed or reproduced without written consent of Water Tower Research and should not be considered research nor recommendation. Water Tower Research is an investor engagement firm, not a licensed broker, broker-dealer, market maker, investment bank, underwriter, or investment advisor. Additional disclosures can be found at www.watertowerresearch.com, along with archived recordings of fireside chats and podcasts, as well as our written research. Thank you for joining us today, everybody. Goodbye.